I see familiar faces.
Oh, that's so nice.
Speaking of Boston.
Love it. Oh, Amy's here.
Hey, Sam and Keisha. Hello. Good luck.
Yes. Thank you for coming.
No worries.
Little reunion.
Love it. Great. Well, we're going to get started. I'm sure some more folks will join us as we move along. But thank you and good afternoon. I know it's tough to attend something like this on a Monday afternoon, evening. So we're really thankful to see you. We have a wonderful chat prepared for you. So this is our CFE community chat series. We kicked this initiative off last April, not having any idea what was going to come of it. And today's session marks our 20th since we started this about a year ago. So it's been a wonderful experience for myself and Kayla, my program associate, and we've just had the opportunity to meet amazing people like Keisha and Sam. And Katie, who's one of our attendees today, is leading her own session in a couple of weeks. So it's kind of nice to see all this involvement. So for those of you new to CFE, the Chicago Foundation for Education. I'm Sarah Hoppy Knight. I'm the co-executive director of CFE. We're a Chicago-based education nonprofit. We've been around for just about 37 years, supporting and funding CPS educators so they can best serve their students and grow in their profession. We've been awarding grants and fellowships and offering PD opportunities to CPS pre-K through 12th grade educators consistently over that almost four-decade period. So we've been around for a while. And again, we are just super thankful that you all decided to join us today. We know that your days are incredibly exhausting, particularly this year and the end of last year, with all the added challenges and emotional turmoil. And we're just so grateful that you chose to spend some of your Monday with us. So a few quick notes before we get started. We're likely going to have a pretty small group. So if you have questions during the presentation, pop them in the chat box. The chat's going to be monitored and addressed throughout the session itself. And then the presentation is being recorded and will be posted along with the slide deck and any associated resources on our website, our resource roundup website, within the next few days. And that's a link that we'll share with you in a follow-up email, probably on Wednesday. And then also just keep an eye out in the chat for helpful messages from Kayla, my program associate, throughout the day, throughout the session. Okay, so let's get into it. Again, we have two wonderful presenters today. Keisha Rembert is an associate professor of teaching preparation at National Louis University. She spent over 15 years teaching middle school English and history in the Chicago area and was named the 2019 Illinois History Teacher of the Year and 2019 NCTE Outstanding Middle Level English Educator. Her passion for equity, social justice, and youth literature coalesce in her membership and work on the NCTE Committee Against Racism and Bias. As a member of the Committee for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion through the Assembly on Literature for Adolescents of NCTE, and in her service on the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center's Educator Advisory Board. Keisha's co-presenter today is Sam Texeira. He moved to Chicago in 2020 after working in Boston Public Schools, where he taught history, African American studies, and civics at the Dr. William W. Henderson K-12 Inclusion School. While at Henderson, Sam facilitated the school's Strong Men, Strong Leaders organization, an organization dedicated to supporting young men of color with leadership training, community service, and the necessary tools to combat negative stereotypes. Sam currently teaches at Roberto Clemente Community Academy in Chicago and sits on the board of City Year Boston. So Keisha and Sam, I will turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. So excited to be with you today and talk about something that I think we're ready to discuss, because as we can end this year, I think we're all looking forward to that. So I'm going to pop the PowerPoint on the screen. Of course, good old Zoom. It worked 5 minutes ago. It's not
It's always like that.
Let's see. Okay, I think I got it. All righty. Well, we are here to talk about the idea that we are ready to reimagine schooling after or through this COVID crisis. And I always love a quote from a good radical. And so Paulo Freire says, looking at the past must only be a means of understanding more clearly what and who they are so that they can more wisely build the future. So let's future build together today. And with that in mind, we're going to show a quick video where our speaker talks about the pandemic as a portal. And as you watch this video, I really want you to think about the words, phrases, ideas that the speaker uses or that come to mind for yourself that could spark cheer or that you challenge based on what the speaker is saying.
What is this thing that has happened to us? It's a virus, yes. In and of itself, it holds no moral brief. But it's definitely more than a virus. Some believe it's God's way of bringing us to our senses. Others, that it's a Chinese conspiracy to take over the world. Whatever it is, coronavirus has made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt like nothing else could. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists. And in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it.
I also need a shirt that says, Miss Rembert, you're on mute, because that happens like all the time. So anyway, I just love her framing of the pandemic as a portal. And there's some words that really stick out to me, like dead rivers and smoky skies, and the rupture exists. So those are the words and phrases that like really attract me to this, because I'm all about letting crumbling structures fall. So I'm just interested to hear what words, ideas, phrases, are there any challenges that you have to anything that she says? Please feel free to use either, we're in such a small group, please feel free to unmute and add to the conversation.
Hi, this is Mike. Let me see. There were a lot of words, right? So I'm trying to get these words, but the things that stuck out to me was portal, another world, ready to fight for it, and then a statement, a phrase that she said, nothing can be worse than a return to normality.
Yes.
And that really stuck out because that's something that I'm kind of grappling with now, is that I necessarily don't want to go back. I want a sense of normalcy, but I don't necessarily want to do the old things that we've been doing. If that's back in the normal, I think that there are opportunities for us to be reinventors and to reimagine and to pull out some of those cool things, especially like with the technology that we've been forced to learn. So that's my statement.
Yeah.
And I'm going back on mute.
I think you touched something that other people, what I'm seeing in the chat is that other people have expressed too, this idea that nothing can be worse than going back to normality. What what are other thoughts? Any challenges to that?
Well, one challenge I had.
I like this idea. As a history teacher, I think I was moved by her comment about pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine the world anew. And essentially, like those of us who've been dismantling and disrupting the status quo in our classrooms around dominant culture perspectives, this resonated for me. That given all that's happening, like we don't have a choice but to break with the past, and some people are holding on to it a little tighter than others, and some of us are just ready to go. But I like that phrase when she said that.
Yeah, I think as a person, a lover of history too, that hits me too. Like, how are we contextualizing, and what do we bring into the space? Sam, you were going to say something?
Yeah, Yolanda, you kind of took the words out of my mouth. Also, history teacher. The phrasing that she used, I think we can choose to walk through dragging the carcasses of our avarice and our hate. I've been thinking a lot about that because I think that we all know that the pandemic has, and even before the pandemic, but particularly this in more recent days, has really opened up a sense of prejudice that can be open, that's not sort of hidden anymore. In one way, I sort of appreciate the ability for people to just sort of be like, this is where I am on this, and I'm going to name this. And I think that that's helpful for people who are interested and invested in like anti-racism, that people are more comfortable. On the other hand, I think that there's something really problematic about that, that people no longer have to like hide a lot of these sort of guttural feelings of racism, of antipathy towards immigrants, and all the rest. And I don't know how at this stage we do that walkthrough with people who are continuing to deny facts or who don't sort of see equity as something that's important. And I like, these are not people who are just sort of fictional characters. Like, these are real people. They are teachers, they're doctors, they're attorneys, they're in our system. And I don't know what that even looks like from here on out. And I think that, obviously it's advantageous for me to say this because I live in the present, but I do also think that the media culture we live in, the fact that information travels so rapidly, that there's new misinformation, really makes that a very difficult sort of thing to navigate moving forward.
Sam, that's such a good point. Like, how I really hadn't considered that. Like, how do we progress through this new portal with people who are carrying the vestiges of racism and hate and non-science, and what do we do with that? What do we do with that? I think that's a great question for y'all. What do we do with it? Any ideas?
The word that was, she didn't say it, but the thing that's resonating with me is permission. Like, I feel like this entire time has there have been so many people with great ideas about how to move forward in our world. And all of this has allowed us to take permission to make progress on social justice, or even just small personal things, to like do things that you've always wanted to do, but you really haven't pushed yourself to go out there and do it. And so I just find that there's a lot of permission that people now have to band together, where you do find commonality and to move forward, and maybe focusing more on trying to focus on those areas, because it's really depressing, I'm sure. I have so many people of color around me who are devastated right now. This is a really hard time, and I get that. And so trying to find those moments of hope to move forward with those, and cling on to that, is maybe one way where you can counteract the other.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I also think our students too, right? Like, so knowing that I am in the classroom and I'm teaching anti-racist tenets and promoting equity, so that this next generation can dissect rhetoric and not and be a better example than the current.
said.
Anyone else? All right, let's move on to our next slide. Of course, that's going to play again. All right. Well, here are our points of entry. Speaking of going through the portal, we're going to talk a little bit today and seek to have conversation and dialogue around these questions. How can our classroom become spaces that mend the trauma of a year of physical distance and academic abnormality? We were really purposeful in the language that's represented in this question. We've seen a lot of words that we don't feel best reflect what's going on in our classrooms, and we wanted to make sure that we didn't promote that type of language. We'll talk a little bit about that language and perspective shifts in a little bit. And how can we shift our priorities to best meet the needs of our students? I think part of the issues that schools have is that everything for us is a priority. And we have to think about what truly is a priority now. And I think if we've learned anything, we've learned that throughout this year. And then what does reconnection socially and academically look like for not only for our students, but for ourselves? So that's where we are landing in terms of our discussion for today. I try to get James Baldwin in any presentation I do. The challenge is in the moment. The time is always now. So before we can move on to the next thing, the challenge is, what is the challenge of the present moment? How are you doing in this moment? I often feel like as educators, no one asks us, no one checks in on us. Like, how are you right now in this moment? If you had to place yourself, where are you and what is the challenge of this moment? So Sam, I'll start with you. What is your challenge in the present moment and how are you doing right now?
Well, right now I'm good because I'm here with you and Yolanda and CFE and others. But in general, so obviously I thought about this as a teacher and I jotted some notes down. And one of the things that I'm really struggling with is both as a teacher, but also as a human being, as a person, struggling with the idea of extending grace and empathy, like understanding that a lot of my students have gone through trauma, while also navigating the sort of ability to prove that I am facilitating a classroom of academic rigor and standards. And I also frankly want kids to learn, right? Like I can't in good conscience, like have students that struggle to read and I know that and I'm simply focused on how they're feeling, right? And the reality is sometimes I think I don't get it right. I don't think every teacher can always get it right. And on the other hand, when we also sort of blame ourselves, the other reality is that the structures themselves don't lend themselves to how we can support students in both. That this is an academic classroom, that I do want you all to learn, that I do feel that there is something important. No, I know that there is something important about you coming here and learning in an academic sense, but I also understand that our students are human beings. And one of the things that I've often said is that I don't teach history, I teach students history. And you can't do that until like you recognize their humanity first. And so I'm struggling with that balance. And I think that that's always a balance that I've struggled with because I've always taught in urban Title I underfunded public schools. But I think now more than ever I feel it, compounded with the complexity of like teaching some kids in person, some kids at home. You see the kids in person and your natural inclination is to go support them. But then you're like, wait a minute, I got kids online here. And so the balancing act is really tough.
So the balance. I think more so than ever, I don't think balance really is a thing, y'all. I don't think balance really exists. Like, and I think of it in terms of even the scale, like the scales of justice, right? Well, that sure as hell ain't real. That balance doesn't exist. And then I think about the balance as an educator. I don't ever feel, maybe y'all have, I've never felt, even when I was in person, I never felt that I was truly balancing it all well. So maybe, Sam, it's about getting rid of that illusion.
Right.
From the beginning. I see some people in the chat rethinking our lenses. Anybody else? How are you doing in the present time? What are you? What are your challenges as educators?
Well, I'm hanging in there.
That's good.
I keep it real. I'm at a stage in life to where it's like, okay, this has been rough. The whole what is a year and a half has been rough. Not in addition, not only have I been trying to keep my students together, and I'm an early childhood teacher, okay? And I've been doing it for about 20 years now. And I work with special needs children. So my focus is different than a lot of other people. And I always felt like I was in a silo. But to manage that and then to manage my own stuff, family members who've taken ill, other distractions that have come, the highs and lows. Yeah, we're going here. Oh no. The social unrest that we've had, the court case from last week, why I could breathe, being an African-American male, it's been a lot. So I'm okay. I'm all right. But you said something that you said you don't think you can have a balance. I think for me, it's been challenging now, but in the past I have had a balance. And I think my balance has been because I've enjoyed every minute that I've been doing what I do. And I find those moments to play and do all of that. So I do have a balance. But it's been a challenge. So I don't want to keep going.
Mike, somebody said you're an angel. You say you were an early childhood educator and that you have joy doing that.
I do. It's been 20 years. I'm created to do what I'm doing. So because I think I'm in the right place at the right time with this whole pandemic and this challenge, I've been able to look at opportunities. I don't want to go back to do the same thing, but I don't want the inequities to keep our babies down. And I've become more of an advocate for early childhood. So whenever I get a platform like now, I'm going to say something about early childhood.
All right.
Because early childhood has always been the minority. Oh, okay, right. The minority. We were the first group coming back into CPS.
Yes. You're the
that was stressful there.
Frontline workers.
That was stressful enough right there. So, but I think that we all are angels. Whoever said that, I appreciate it. But I think that we all, are angels in our own right. So,
thank you for sharing that. Anyone else want to talk about just where you are at present, where you are on the barometer, and what your challenge is in this moment?
When you were talking about the balance, it made me think of the word juggling is maybe what feels more appropriate, because a lot of times we drop the ball in our attempts to keep it all going. And sometimes we're, more focused in one area than another, but we work to keep it all going. And I've really worked to give myself grace when I don't live up to my expectations, because I think mine are far higher than what other people expect of me. So, and that's always been the case, even in a normal time. So to even more so having to just be okay when it doesn't go the way you want, because it's never going to go the way it did. When you were in the groove, and I'm definitely that in-person kind of teacher. And I've been very grateful to have been back since March, 2 days a week with students, and that fed my soul. And, and I'm like, man, I know what I was missing. And so even though you go home tired, it just feels I got filled up socially, in a way that was missing in front of a computer screen. So I'm going to keep on juggling, and hopefully the balls will get lighter and we won't be throwing anything with fire. So.
What a great analogy. Thank you for sharing that. So we also think that crisis reveals, right? And we have some questions here just for all of us to think about. How has education defined this crisis? Because I think a lot of times we talk about it in terms of the crisis defining education, but how has education defined the crisis? And what has this crisis revealed about our own systems? And I think we've talked about that a little bit. It's revealed the inequities that exist. And to think about what is revealed about you, your school, your community, and how has it redefined what education is can and should be? So I'm going to just throw those questions as just large scale questions for things that I want us to think about as we go through this presentation, because I think they're really important to kind of keep in the back of our minds. And we talked a little bit about this as well, but Sam and I were talking about just the importance of shifting perspective and shifting our language. And if this COVID crisis has taught me anything, it's really taught me this, that there is no normal, that normal never worked, and that I've seen a lot about learning loss, right? And it drives me crazy. It drives me crazy when I hear about learning loss. I have little cousins, I have children who didn't lose learning. What they did was they increased their learning stamina. And framing it that way, how can we build on the increased learning stamina? Our children learned under really difficult circumstances. And that took effort, and that took everything I had to get through it. And so that required stamina. And so how can we build on that versus building on a deficit, on the deficit language of learning loss? And then along those same lines, we talk in terms of social loss. And instead of focusing on social loss, how can we as educators shift our perspective and our language to really focus on that social reconnection that we need as human beings too, as educators, but that our students most certainly need. And then I just wanted to talk a little bit about our own trauma. So we're talking about students and their traumas, but there's been a lot written lately just about the trauma that educators have endured, that we are experiencing really high levels of stress, especially as we think about returning next fall when there aren't as many parameters around. And we know how fast we had to pivot in the spring of last year, and to think about, have we built structures that are safe, equitable, and are going to sustain us through even this next school year? We've been juggling, as was said, all of these different priorities: supporting students, managing our own families, managing students' families. And what does it look like to acknowledge our own trauma and heal from it? So I'm just really going to also leave that there, because while we think about our students and we put our children in high regard, I am of the mindset that we have to put the oxygen mask on ourselves first. So we can't help our students with the traumas that they are necessarily and absolutely going to be facing without first addressing the ones that we have, and addressing them in a forum in our schools as a community, so that our system starts to think about trauma as something that we're all dealing with. I know my former principal had a way of always focusing, we're children-centered, we're children first. And I'm like, we are, but if I'm not healthy, then those children aren't going to be healthy. And so thinking about healthy overall systems for all of us.
All right. So should I share my screen? Is that? Oh, I can't hear you, Keisha. Sorry.
I'm not on mute. I'm on mute. I can keep doing it if you want. You can just.
It makes no difference to me.
Okay, I'll keep it. I can keep doing it.
All right, cool. So we wanted to leave you all with something to sort of think about in terms of what Ready to Reimagine looks like in your classroom or otherwise educational spaces. And so McEwen and Jones have a model of multiple identities. And one of the things that's important is that we all sort of understand our personal identities, things like race, sexuality, religion, gender, language. But one of the things that's also important to remember is that these identities often become more salient or more core depending on specific contexts that we are in. And so I'll give you all a couple of examples. If somebody were to say, Sam, describe yourself to me, The word American would be like probably number 19. It's just not something. Bald would be higher than American because it's just not something I necessarily think about. However, when I travel internationally, it's one of the first identities that sort of is salient to me, that I am culturally different from the people around me. Another sort of example that might be a little bit more pertinent to what's going on is I have full use of my ambulatory factories. I'm not disabled. I can walk. However, I didn't always directly think about the ableism in our society until 5 years ago. I injured myself and I couldn't walk for 3 months. And so that forced my identity, a temporary identity as a disabled person, to be more salient in my life. So next slide, please. So why is all this important? Well, in the first place, we know that the pandemic is a huge contextual backdrop for all of our students. It doesn't matter where you sort of ended up in this pandemic. There's no way possible to sort of not think about how our identities have been shaped by this pandemic. Even frankly, if it's a privileged identity that our kids, our young people, and frankly, our staff members aren't always sort of thinking about. Sort of like going along with that, not all of our students or communities have felt the impacts of this pandemic or remote learning in the same way. We all know that. But one of the notes I included as well is to just not make individual assumptions. We don't want to assume that like this was a struggle for everybody. And while it may have been for many people, I, for example, have students that have said, you know what, this was a really good time to get close to my family. This was a really good time for me to learn based on my style of learning. I've have lots of students on the spectrum who definitely also told me that they preferred this for their own style. And so understanding that like while things have been different for different people and different communities, there's both an individual and a community factor. And the final thing is, well, why is this important? Because in order to empower our students, we have to think intentionally about how their own identities have been shaped by the context around us. So let's see. Oh, sorry. Keisha wrote, I've had students who thrive during this online learning. Yeah, I have too. And I think that's really important to name. And I talk about this a little bit later, but I think moving forward, as we think about what is reimagining our classroom spaces and our instruction, we have to be honest about that too, because we can't just leave those students out in the woods and say, well, this worked for you, and now all of a sudden it's gone.
I'm sorry, Sam. I was just going to add too, like, it's like a safe, like I've had students say they've never felt as safe as they do in a learning environment because they're at home learning in the safety of their own homes. And I think that's something to consider when our students say things like that. How then are we reimagining even the safety element of school for our students?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I just did an activity with students recently, and one of the students talked about being bullied at school and how that has gone away now that she's home. I've had students in the past who've like had issues with physically getting to school because they walk through neighborhoods that aren't safe, for example. And now in many ways for them, that's not a factor. Next slide.
Just while you're switching slides, I was, I'm in a lot of classrooms just for, you know, like one period at a time. And I have seen lots of movement opportunities at home that don't exist in the classroom too. I've seen some cartwheels and all kinds of crazy, great stuff, you know.
Yeah, I'd love if we could just put a pin right here, Sam, really quickly, because I would love to hear about Yolanda. What would you attribute your son's success to in this online space to be? And then Rachel, you make a really good point just about Ramadan being able to like there are some cultural things that sometimes we don't think about and don't do a good job in the school space of providing for. Yolanda?
Yeah, I would say by no means is the system perfect, but one thing that the online learning has done for him, and he's back now 5 days a week, but what's been really interesting is that the teachers have had to, he's in an inclusion school where half of the kids have IEPs and the other half don't. And for him, it's, you know, he needs to see it, he needs to read it, and it's forced the teachers to have to do that by using Google Classroom. So for him, you know, when he misses something, because he often does, he can go back to it. And like I said, it's not perfect, but it's given teachers new tools by which to also engage all students. And so for him, you know, he's a sixth grader, now he has, you know, grades, but it looks a lot different than what it did when he was in person. And, you know, he's been able to articulate that he logs in, he's on his time. But that's been different. Where for my daughter, who's 9, she's learned to navigate all the technology. She's perfect at it, but she's more like she needs to be with her friends, right? She's more the social. So she's been figuring out how to have her little like play dates online and how to figure that all out because she actually missed school. So they're both different, but they're both succeeding in their own way. But yeah, that's, and for him, it's just been like, there are not too many moving parts. He logs in, he's got a schedule, and that for a kid who has, social pragmatic language issues where we've been working on that. It's been a game changer for him. And even my own students at school, I see some of them who chosen to be remote. They've also said the same thing.
Yeah, I think simplifying school is something that we have to also carry through that portal. We've seen that we've complicated school on so many levels. And thanks, Rachel, for saying that about Ramadan, because I think that's also really important, that identity piece that Sam talked about.
All right, so we started talking about this a bit, but we have 3 questions. One of the things that Keisha and I talked about was that whenever I give my students open-ended questions, I always sort of tell them, like, you can answer a bunch about 1, you can answer a little bit about 3. We can take this whatever direction we want to go. I did say that at this point, I'll give people like, let's do 2.5 minutes to like stop and think about this. Feel free to turn off your camera, get a snack, do whatever you need to do. But feel free to just think about any of these 3 and hopefully we come back. We'd love to hear. So our questions are, which identities might have become more salient for students as a result of anything at all the last 14 months, but particularly the COVID pandemic? How, why, or in what ways might this have happened? And then the third is, are there any events other than the pandemic and virtual learning or things that are connected to those sort of contexts that we're missing or that we're not thinking about when we think about our students in the last 14 months and what identities might have become more salient for them? So I'll put a timer on for 2.5 minutes. Feel free to stretch, take a break. If anybody wants to lead us in a stretch, or turn off your cameras and get a snack. Or just think and not be on camera for 2.5 minutes. I'll let everybody know when we're down to 30 seconds. All right, we're down to 30 seconds. 10 more seconds. All right, so I'd love to hear what anybody came up with. Again, I like to do this sort of organically, so feel free to answer one or all of them. Keisha, did you want to start us off, or anybody for that matter?
Sure, I can start us off. I'm going to just use my son as an example. So he was a senior last year and kind of missed his volleyball season, missed graduation and prom. And so he started off kind of with this identity of like, oh goodness gracious, how I don't know how to put it. He saw himself as he saw himself as an other, right? Everybody else gets, and I'm the other who doesn't get. But then as the summer progressed, he started to really, and this was a really good thing. I live in a suburb where he doesn't see many people who look like him. He started to identify himself as a Black boy in ways that he hadn't prior. And I think it was just the events of the summer. It was the protests that he gained a voice and started engaging in. And he took that voice and all of that onto the campus with him. And so I think sometimes we're missing this role of advocate that some of these students have adopted through all that they've been through, and just the social justice lens that they came with. So he started off with this deficit framing of self, and then gained elements of himself throughout this. And so it did, what started off to be something kind of negative has really evolved into this powerful representation of who he is.
Thank you for sharing that. Elizabeth, I think you were going?
Hi, as I think about this, I teach younger students, third graders, and I think about how much their identity is surrounded by family right now. Their older siblings, their younger siblings, aunts and uncles who come into their home to care for them, and grandma and grandpa, and how that identity, and it's different for each family and child, and some are very more independent than they were before because of the trust they've been given through their family. Some are more responsible for littler ones. And I am curious and excited to explore how to continue those thriving relationships when things go back into a classroom and kids aren't at home as much, but trying to figure out ways to continue that connection with those core people in their homes. And again, it's different for every family, and I'm not saying every family has had that experience, but I often see little brother climbing up on the lap of a child and they're still focused, and I don't know how. But they have this role that I've never been able to glimpse before. And I can only imagine if they're in it 24/7, that it's become a more salient identity. Not that it wasn't before, but it's constant now, right? So figuring, I as a teacher want to honor that, explore that, and figure out a way to make sure that isn't something that is left behind.
Thank you for sharing that. That's outstanding. Anybody else? Any other questions or anything that's on your mind, frankly?
What do you think you packed it in? I was just going to comment a little bit about just tech specifically. I think that teachers and students have had a fraught and schools have had a fraught relationship with tech. It's sort of like, we don't have enough, we don't have the stuff. And that sort of, the fact that, how many devices did CPS purchase? 100,000 or some giant number like that. And so it really put everybody into a space where they were having to rethink their relationship with tech. And I just love it when, teachers are like, all my kindergartners can mute and unmute, and all my kindergartners can, do some tech thing that I think the teacher probably maybe was thinking that they couldn't even do at the beginning of the year. And so I think that everybody's really made a lot of progress and sort of been rethinking that relationship for good or for bad in some places. So anyway.
I was just going to comment about the fact that for some of the adults in our school community, that they've become more aware of the multiple identities that kids have. So it's not just the identities are salient for the kids, but that teachers have also had to realize, like, oh, this kid actually is caring for a sibling or translating for a parent or having to take 2 buses to school. Like all of that was, that I could see that, right? And then the other piece that we don't really talk about, but more people are talking about is the trauma, right? Like how real that was, and how teachers have had to, we've done a lot of work this year around trauma-informed teaching. And some of us as teachers of color, we're like, oh, we've been there, right? And it's not new. And as a history teacher, right? When I'm teaching about, the Jim Crow era and teaching about lynching, which is part of our historical past, it's all been trauma informed, right? For students who come into my space. But that now all of a sudden I see teachers going like, oh, you're the kid who's not just the good math student or the excellent English writer. You also are somebody's, sibling, and you're somebody's child, and you're having to navigate, a multi-generational home, and your grandparent, you're staying home because the reality of COVID is, there were so many layers, and seeing everyday teachers sort of addressing those pieces, a lot of unlearning.
Well said. Anybody else?
I was thinking a lot about students' relationships with their families and how those identities, I think, often already really existed, but perhaps, as Yolanda was saying, are more visible to the teachers in their lives. But I work with high school students, and my oldest students are up to 21. And many of them have not only really become caregivers for siblings, but often taking care of their families and their parents and grandparents if family members were ill. Several of my students are sole income earners. And so I think those identities as being really essential contributors within their homes, and not just children who are being taken care of. And then also finding that balance of being 17 and caretaking still is also a space to want to be taken care of, and thinking about how to create those balances and supports in and out of our buildings and in and out of students' homes.
Thank you for naming that. That is really critical. I've, off the top of my head, at least 10 students that I know who are working upwards of 30 hours a week to supplement family income. We're not talking about, because they want gas money or they want to go on dates. And in some ways, it's really heart-wrenching to know that we live in a society where that has to happen. But in other ways, it also sort of inspires me that these are young people who are fully sort of like grown intellectually, maturity-wise. These are often several of them have like physically come back to school, and they've sort of told me like they're working through the balance. And I've often found that these are students who sort of know themselves. And I think that that's going to be a really important life skill. An attribute. The ones that that came to mind to me. So obviously I think race is pretty obvious. I think class is pretty obvious. One that has recently come up a lot for me, and speaking about Generation Z and like how radically informed they are, and I love it, is how they're able to talk about issues of mental health. And to the extent that mental health is an identity or how we perceive it to be that way. When I was growing up in the 90s and the 2000s, the words mental health would have been like, nobody wanted to talk about it. Nobody wanted to talk about, going to counseling or anything like that. And that's not that long ago in context. Today, students are very open about it. We had an activity recently where a lot of students have talked about both their struggles with mental health, but also how over the pandemic, they've sort of learned to navigate their own struggle, their own issues with it better, and to be more open about like their needs and to be more open about it with their families, because very often when schools are the places that provide mental health supports, I think a lot of families, in my experience and what students have told me, don't always necessarily see it as like, because they're coming from a different generation, well, what's the big deal? And so now I think that a lot of families are sort of understanding it more intimately because we're so connected. Let's see, just reading the chat. Open dialogue.
And I'm on it, Sam. I got it.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah. Cool. All right. Next slide. All right. So a couple of things, or a few things just to leave us with, or almost leave us with. Obviously, this has not been felt equally by everybody. So we need to be cognizant of our students and their identities, whether it's race, ethnicity, social class, language, as Yolanda, you mentioned about like being an interpreter. All of these identities are going to be salient, or very well could be salient for many of our students in the face of this. And we need to be aware of that when they come in, and we need to be aware of it without making assumptions. That's really important. For students who thrived during this, we also need to know why this is important for them too. You know, if a student felt like this was the first time that he or she was safe, if a student felt like he or she sort of learned more without all of the extra things that are often in education, this should sort of give us pause to think, how do we continue to support and accommodate for that student as well? Because school should not be a sort of place that certain students feel that they are getting an education and others aren't, based on learning style, family, what have you. And then finally, as was mentioned earlier, the pandemic has largely exposed a system that already existed. And so poverty and racism and violence aren't new. And so if we're thinking about getting back to where things were, then we're always going to be in a system that's not, that doesn't yield equity, because we've never had an equitable system. And so again, just keep in mind that the title of this is Ready to Reimagine. We all have to do reimagining, and it's not easy. I think that every single day I try to reimagine things, and some things, sometimes I try it doesn't work, and sometimes I do and it does. But I think that this Ready to Reimagine sort of has to be a culture with us moving forward, not just in the face of the pandemic. And then next slide.
Sure. And then I'll just add this too. I'm a big fan of Dr. Bettina Love. And so I really think about this as an opportunity for us to do collective freedom dreaming. And so really we can start thinking about, what does liberation and educational freedom look like for all students through this lens? So I go back to that, to the video that we saw, and think about the smoke and the dead rivers, and think about how we don't have to resurrect that which is dead. We can construct anew, and in constructing anew, we can liberate those students who have for far too long been have not had an educational system that leads to freedom and equity.
Well said. All right, so the last thing I'll leave you all with is Tara Yasso. She's a scholar out of USC, and she writes about community cultural wealth. Yolanda earlier mentioned like the sort of like dominant cultural perspective, and I think that probably most people understand what that looks like, that oftentimes our schools and our educational spaces sort of privilege the idea of upper middle class white culture, that is the sort of dominant cultural capital in education spaces. And one of the things that's going to be really important for us to do moving forward, as Keisha mentioned earlier, is to reframe how we think about language, to reframe the sort of like ways in which we are all susceptible to thinking about our students, our communities, our schools in a sort of deficit mindset. And community cultural wealth model really reframes how we can start to do that. And more importantly, how we can do that with our students, not just sort of on our own. Because if it's all here, and if we're not sort of transmitting this idea to students about and being intentional about what we're doing, then the question is, why are we doing it? So next slide, please. So I think that was the, thank you. So Yasso's academic work, her scholarship, really started with students of color in college. And effectively, what she wanted students of color to understand is that despite experiencing marginalization in their lives, they come to this table with plenty of cultural wealth by virtue of the fact that they've had to navigate systems that are not built for their success. And so there's all sort of ways that we often don't think about, but should, what cultural capital is. And what's really important for us is to help our students to get to the place that they understand that they're coming in the door with a lot of cultural capital by virtue of the resilience that they have sort of cultivated in life. And one of the things that's important to know is that this doesn't just happen because of like white people, that our students are also like internally biased to see white upper middle class values as being what is sort of important in the classroom setting, and that their life experience doesn't always reflect how we value education. And so we have to sort of upend their idea of that. We have to sort of unpack that as well with our students. And so if you can go to the next slide, please. So one of the ways that this is done is through a cultural wealth wheel. I've done modified versions of these, and effectively you get students to think about the ways in which they come to the classroom or they come to the school or whatever the educational space is with strengths despite what they may have internalized themselves. And so thinking about, well, what are the family supports in your community? What languages do you speak? How have you navigated structures in your life that have taught you sort of resiliency? And one of the things that's really important is that not every student may not occupy every single aspect of this cultural capital, but there's something that they can lean on. And when you do this kind of activity with students, you sort of get the ability to talk openly about equity, to talk very openly about what equity means in the sort of classroom, and to not make students think that this is an issue of self or that this is simply about their identity as a person, but how can we all sort of approach this so that we all rise together? I know we're short on time, but the sort of questions I have are, how might you modify something like this in your class? I know we have educators of all ages here, and so this would look very different in the high school than it would in a kindergarten classroom, for example. How can this be used to support individuals and community? This is very important because students should look at this and do this activity with the ability to believe that they themselves have strength, but also to undo narratives about people of color, marginalized communities, impoverished communities, and so on. This also has to be done in conjunction with a group as well. And so that might be doing it individually first and then building the relationship to be able to do this openly where people are more vulnerable. And then finally, what limitations do you see on something like this? I know we're short on time. I do want to give people a chance to sort of talk if you'd like or to speak. I think, is this our last slide, Keisha? I think it is. Could be wrong. Oh, it's not? Can you just jump ahead real quick? I just want to see it. Oh, you know what? Okay, I'll zoom through this. Last but not least, just because it's an article that you all can reference, 2019, really interesting article on trauma. Upwards of 2/3 of students, according to the CDC, experience trauma. This is well before the pandemic. And so this is a really good article on what teachers individually can do in our classrooms to support to support trauma-informed learning activities and so on and so forth. Remember that students can't learn if they don't feel safe. And if you could just do one more slide ahead. And so again, there's plenty in there. There's way more than 6, but I just linked the 6 that I think are most important. Contextualize responses, employ thoughtful reactions, be intentional about relationship building, promote predictability and consistency, which is important. Change the channel on negative thinking. When kids sort of get into a negative rut, like how do you refocus their mindset so that that's not what's constantly on their mind in the classroom activity, in the classroom or during an activity. And then obviously giving support and feedback that create islands of confidence. So, you know, always remembering to build students up before we critique, to build students up, to support students so that they feel that if they get an answer wrong, or if you're revising a paper and there's marks on it that tell them what to change, they also feel solidified that they're a strong student as well. So again, I know that was a lot in a short amount of time. I do want to open it up to anybody, whether it's the questions here about supporting students through trauma or the questions before, a couple of slides before. Let me see. I know we have several things in the chat.
Yeah, I think Rachel mentioned the Goldie Muhammad book. Oh my goodness, I'm gonna forget the name of it.
Yeah, I'm not actually familiar with it.
Huh?
I'm not familiar with this, so I'll write it down.
Oh my goodness. Rachel.
Cultivating Genius.
Cultivating Genius. Oh my goodness. I feel crazy. And it would absolutely work well. Yes, and it's like probably on a stack somewhere around me, but it's amazing. It's got that historical inquiry model, and it's a really great book. And then Yolanda, I know you did your TED Talk on trauma. So what did you learn, or what bits do you have to share with us? Because you really researched for it.
Yeah, my school is a TEDx site, so we have a license for that. And so I did mine on experiencing trauma as a student, but also looking at transgenerational trauma and looking at, looking at all of it, but looking at it from the lens of my mother, the trauma she experienced, and you put in there how the percentage of students who experience trauma, right? But 70% of adults have experienced trauma, either racial trauma or psychological trauma, physical trauma. And so I spoke about my mom, myself as a student, a cousin who got really, I grew up in Philadelphia, so the crack epidemic and the opioid crisis were things that were really prevalent in the community I grew up in. So I speak about how some of this can be cyclical and how you break free of. And essentially my point was that trauma was not my end point, that it didn't define me, that it was a place of growth and reflection. So I'll give you the YouTube link, Keisha, when it becomes published. So yeah.
I can't wait to tweet it out.
Thank you.
Anything else? Other things that you all might do in your classroom to support students who've experienced trauma, or we can take it back to the cultural wealth wheel and thinking about how we support students who may come to the classroom feeling that they don't bring cultural capital and reframing that idea.
I think it's such a cool way to the wheel, Sam. Is just such a cool way to, I think about even for younger kids, bringing in text and books that celebrate and using that as a way for a teacher, for students to talk about their own wealth and connect it in that way. So I think even just images, if I were an early childhood educator, bringing images in and asking students to talk and connect through those images would be awesome.
I also think it would be important to sort of do two sets. Like I spoke about individual and communal, but also to do one maybe at the beginning of the year and one at the end, because ideally we should be building students to believe that and not to believe, but to know that they are strong and resilient, and to know that there's not sort of an endpoint to that. And so I think that that's a really important activity to sort of facilitate growth mindset and to sort of like build relationships on both an individual and a classroom level with our young people.
Great. One last slide. I was just going to ask, what's a necessary tool in your toolkit for success for next year? As we think about reimagining, being ready to reimagine, what's a tool that you feel like you really need for next year?
Do it. For me, it's outdoor space and getting kids outside again. I've noticed a lot of my students haven't moved a lot and not been outside in nature. And I want to find space and time to make sure that we can go and just sit in the grass and be outside together safely and like create experiences outdoors again. That will be a tool that I am looking to hone.
Yeah. And that was something that I had always wanted. Like I had always imagined how wonderful it would be to teach math in the garden, because we have an active school garden, and I just didn't make it happen. And so when I was thinking about I now have the permission because we have to be outside as much as possible. And so now I'm teaching, multiplication and mathematics in the garden, and, it's bringing out children that maybe don't feel the confidence in math, but they love the garden. And so it's building confidence in a way that I wasn't doing before, even though I had wanted to.
Great point.
So next year will be my 10th year in the classroom. And one of the things that I really struggled with, and I think I still do and probably will throughout my career, is saying no to things and taking time for me. But I do feel that as I've gone through my career, I've gotten better at it. Keisha and I talked about this a while ago. I think that there's now this sort of like, now that we're virtual, there's like a meeting for everything, because I think people just feel like we can fit more in. Yeah, and so being aware of that, and also like being able to say no to things, and being able to have at least one day a week where I don't do anything school related. And that's something I struggle with for 9 years in this career. And I think this year I finally said like, no, this is too much. And I think it was the fact that I'm bringing work into my home and it crossed the line that I didn't really like. And I'm not going back. I will definitely always have Saturday or Sunday for just me.
That's good. That's really good. Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
We're sorry we went over a little bit, and feel free to ask us at least one question now if you want to, or add in one comment. We will make this available for you to send it, Sarah, so you can send it out, and we'll put our contact information too.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. I feel like this could have been 3 separate sessions, so probably tap you again if you're interested. But you both are just so knowledgeable, and I just think come from such unique spaces, but also, you just kind of work off each other really well. So I thought, even though today was a little small, I thought it was great. So hopefully everyone here enjoyed themselves. Keisha mentioned, and Kayla popped it in the chat, but I'll be sending a follow-up email probably on Wednesday. We ask that you complete a survey about today's session, and then we'll provide you a link to the recording and a link to the slide deck. There were a lot of resources shared, I think, verbally, which is great. And so if you receive that email and there's something that you really would like to share with somebody, or share with the group, that would be great. Just respond to it. And I think that's it. If you have any other, again, this was our 20th chat of the series that we've done since last April. If you have other ideas on chats we can host, people we might want to talk to, they've really run along the spectrum. So we've done some, Pilates and yoga classes. We've done some self-care stuff. We've done a ton of content-based chats, and so we're really open to any ideas. So please feel free to share those with us too. But again, Keisha and Sam, thank you so much for being here and preparing this wonderful presentation, and just offering the space for all of us to have a really wonderful conversation. So at any rate, that's it for us. And
Bye, everyone.
Everybody have a good night. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Keisha. Miss you too. Bye-bye.
I miss you.
Mwah. Miss you.
Bye, Rachel.
Bye-bye.
I'm reaching you across.